You've all heard those 90s ambient pads like this, which by now we all know typically started off in a sample-based synthesizer such as the Korg Triton, Trinity, or M1. But how do you actually create those sounds? In this video, I'm going to show you how. I've done tons of videos on how to get that sound using samplers, but the most common question I get asked is, great, but you started with a preset, how do you actually make the preset itself? So I think it's about time I put out an updated video on creating something from scratch in a rompler like the Korg Triton, so let's get into it. So what we've done is pulled up the Korg Triton here, and I have a initialize patch here. To initialize a patch, just go to menu initialize and you end up with this. And we're going to make a sound from scratch. Now, when designing pads, one of the first things I like to do is sculpt the amplitude envelope. And so this is the overall feel of the sound, how when you press a key, it fades in, drops in level, decays naturally, and has a bit of a release. So for a pad, if I come over to amp envelope here, we typically want a very slow attack. So we have our start level down at 0, and then we grab our attack level all the way up here. And then we want to decay it a little and then sustain at a lower volume than that peak, and then put a good bit of release on there. So this should give us a nice pad type envelope. And this is where I will always start when designing a pad sound. It's almost like you're creating context for the overall vibe of the sound here. Now the next thing we need to think about is the oscillators. In most romplers will provide you multiple layers. So in the Korg Triton, you have 2 oscillator layers, which essentially means you can stack up 2 oscillators. Now, when I'm thinking about pads, it's important to think in layers, in that one layer needs to carry a lot of the body of your pad, and then another layer kind of deals with all that weird wispiness that happens on top. And so what I want to do is just start with the bottom layer. So I'm thinking about the body of the pad sound. And if I come into the oscillators here, and the Triton specifically, almost 1,000 different oscillators I could potentially use. But we do know things like traditional analog waveforms make for good bodies to pads. So I could search for a sawtooth in here and use something like a detuned saw. And that is actually a very analog sounding pad there, because I'm using a sample of a sawtooth wave, which you can also find in an analog synth. And so I have a great body here that I can use. And now I can start to think about what I want that next layer to be. And so I'm going to come into oscillators here, enable my second layer, go back to easy mode. Then I'm going to select my oscillator 2 set here. In ambient pad design like this, figuring out what that next layer is where a lot of the creativity comes in. I just did a video on designing ambient samples in a sampler, and a lot of that technique applies to romplers as well, because when you think about it, it's essentially a sampler too. So a lot of these oscillators in here, when you play them at different pitches, even in a rompler, you will get that grit as you pitch up and down. So for that top layer, if I come into categories here, and most romplers will categorize the oscillators, what you want to look for is just weird sound, typically things that loop up. So some of these, like a little hit sound, aren't going to be good for looping up in a pad. So if I come into maybe SC2 here, we have something like crickets. Now, if I turn down the volume of oscillator 1 and we just listen to this cricket sound, that's at middle C, but if I pitch it down or pitch it up, it's literally a sample of crickets. Same effect happens in a rompler that happens in a sampler. Pitch up, pitch down, you get this different feel. And so you can use that to your advantage to mangle up weird sounds to layer on top. And hopefully this is starting to all come together. So what I may do is come in and I'm going to search for Twinkler Rev. I already know this is a great little sample here. It sounds like this. A nice loop there. And so I'm going to go back to oscillator 1, bring that amp envelope back up so we have both sounds playing in context. First thing I notice, this Twinkler Rev a little loud, so I'm going to bring the amp envelope down. And I'm actually going to come back to oscillator 1. I think the volume's a little low after it decays out, so I'm going to bring the sustain up a bit here. Let's see how this goes. Now I'm going to come back to oscillator 2 here, and what I want to do is just transpose this up plus 12 here. I want to make it very wispy to really separate it from that body, that synth sawtooth. So next thing I want to do is think about the amp envelope for this top layer sound. Currently, you press a key, it just starts playing. I want to fade that in with a very pad-like envelope. So similar to the first layer, I'm going to come in, sculpt a little bit of a envelope here. There you go. Like, this is already taking shape here, and we really haven't even done that much. What I'm going to do next is actually just go to the effects. Definitely a very dry sound, and so I want to start doing things like thickening it up, and what I may do for that is a bit of a chorus. And then on the master effects here, I'm just going to put a nice sexy reverb. Now let's come back into here, and I'm going to take my Twinkler Rev here. So this is that motion layer, that oddity that sits on top of our bass here, and I want to start adding some movement and interest to this. Now the first thing I'm going to do is go to amp here, and then I'm going to go to modulation, and you'll see under oscillator 2 we can modulate the panning of that sound, which will essentially give it movement. So I'm going to come in here and use LFO1 to modulate the panning of oscillator 2, which is that up top layer. So our bottom layer, that body, that synth body of the pad, will kind of sit in place, and then that top sound will be flying all throughout this stereo field. So we'll apply some intensity. Let's actually mute the first sound. We want to go to LFO 1 here. Let's change it to a sine, which is a little more smooth. And then let's bring that speed way down. We want a very, very slow panning. And let's tempo sync it, because let's not do that. Let's key sync it. So when I press a key, it'll start in phase there. So let's go back to amp modulation. Let's go back to LFO. Let's slow it down. Oh, whoops, I was doing the wrong LFO. Let's come down to this one. Let's drop that speed. So we've now added some movement to that top sound to help, again, just create some interest in here. So we can bring that other one back in. Now, we can make this a little bit more interesting in that we can add some more movement and interest to the second sound by using pitch modulation. And again, I just had a video on manipulating samples in a sampler with pitch. A lot of those concepts are the same, again, in a Rompler. So I'm going to come into pitch here, and what I'm going to do is just draw in a little bit of a pitch envelope here. I'm not really going to think about what it's going to do. I'm just going to draw it in. So I have this envelope. I can now apply it to oscillator 2. And if I come back and just mute the first oscillator, now, how that pitch modulation actually sounds is going to really depend on the sound you have in here. So, for example, if I just take something else, like if we swap out the sound with this applause sound here, and we pitch it way up, we play a chord. And I think what's cool is as you start to add some movement to any of these layers, it's so easy to just swap out the sound of them and keep like the characteristics of that movement in here. So I can come in and just like really quickly try different sounds within here. Now, if we wanted to get crazy here, we can start to begin to mess around with filters. So on the analog sound, I could just use a low pass here and do like a slow sweep here to open it up. And then, as I mentioned with the top layer, we can begin to think about just swapping out the sound on the bottom layer. So I could come in here. I like a lot of airy vocal pads. So for that, some type of vocal sample on the bottom is typically really good, like this. And this is kind of the basics of designing a pad from scratch. Now, something else you can do to really start to wrap your head around like techniques and how they came up with these sounds is just come into your favorite synth, go into the category of sounds you like, and pull a sound that you like. And once you have that sound open, it's so easy to come in and just change the oscillators, which can completely change the sound and give you something unique. So I encourage you, take existing sounds you like, duplicate them, and then just start tweaking them, and you're essentially just reverse engineering them. You'll learn a ton doing that and end up with some unique sounds as well. Hope you guys enjoyed. Have a good one.